Tonight, I'm going to have the pleasure of introducing to you Dr. Paul Kim. Kim has spoken here before, but it wasn't the same subject that he's going to speak on tonight. He spoke on a different subject before. Tonight he wants to talk about Space-Oar Hydrogel. If you could hold your questions until after his talk, we'll give everybody the opportunity to ask any question that they would like. And Dr. Kim, I know from experience, is very benevolent in giving his information. So hold your questions until after the talk. Tonight he'd like to talk about reducing the rectal side effects from radiotherapy with the Space-Oar Hydrogel. Space-Oar is relatively new. I'm not sure just off the top of my head how long it was FDA approved, but I'm sure Dr. Kim can address that subject. He'll talk about the clinical use of Space-Oar Hydrogel in prostate radiotherapy. And he'll talk about the rationale for Space-Oar, the clinical trial data for Space-Oar, and the implementation of Space-Oar in the clinic. Dr. Kim is a Southern California native who graduated with honors from Stanford University, majoring in biological science. Dr. Kim obtained his medical degree from Yale University School of Medicine and returned to California to complete his internship in Santa Clara Valley Medical Center, San Jose, and radiation oncology residency at California Pacific Medical Center, San Francisco, where he was the chief resident. He then completed his fellowship in Proton Therapy at the Massachusetts General Hospital of Harvard Medical School. Dr. Kim, you've traveled around and went to the best of the best. Wow, this is an impressive resume. He had additional training in prostate radiation at the Seattle Prostate Institute and Memorial Sloan Kettering Cancer Center. Are there any major institutes that you've missed? Throughout his career, he has been active in cancer research and has published numerous articles in leading journals. Dr. Kim is a board-certified radiation oncologist and is the medical director of Skyland Radiation Oncology right here in Tustin, California. It's with great pleasure that the Prostate Forum of Orange County introduces to you Dr. Paul Kim.
Thanks for that kind introduction. It's great to be back here again, talking to you about one of the latest developments in radiation technology. We're always striving as radiation oncologists to try to make our therapy more safe for the patients, with less toxicity. And one of the organs that gets affected the most is certainly the rectum, which is sitting right behind the prostate. So, disclosures, I have received honorary from Bayer and Augmentics. And here's the clinical challenge. This is a rectum sitting right behind the prostate right here. Here's another view. The prostate and the rectum right behind. That's why you can do a digital rectal exam. You can feel the back side of the prostate where a lot of prostate tumors can originate. So the challenge for radiation oncologists is trying to hit this target, the prostate, while minimizing exposure to the rectum. And a lot of times it's difficult because there is broad contact with the prostate. The other challenge with prostate radiation is the fact that the prostate does move. And this is like a live video of how it can move, whether you have a full rectum or an empty rectum. idea of this video, I'm sorry it's not functional right now, is that you'll see here that the prostate, depending on if you have a full rectum here, can actually push the prostate a little forward. And then even with the rectum not full, you can see the bladder and the pelvic floor muscle can also exert pressure on the prostate so it can move up and down and forwards. And so there is always some residual movement of the prostate that makes it challenging for highly accurate targeting. To compensate for that, this is another example how we actually are able to quantitate that kind of movement, where we have done studies, motion studies, where in this case electromagnetic beacons called Calypso were physically inserted into the prostate. It's kind of like a GPS system where during radiation you can get information in real time from these intraprostatic markers, and you can see these markers here. Some of them will deviate this way or this way or this way. Sometimes it doesn't move at all. This is prostate motion during radiation, and a lot of it, and this can all be from the same patient on different days. It tells you how erratic and random the motion is, and that presents a challenge in planning radiation treatments for highly mobile target. So there's this concept called the radiation planning margin. So because of that potential movement, we generally treat area safety margin around the prostate, so that during radiation beam delivery, if the prostate moves this way or this way, if you treat a large enough circle, you will be highly certain that you're going to hit the target in the prostate. But the larger the circle is, the more rectum here will be caught in there, or the bladder neck. So that with highly more accurate machines, we've been able to reduce the size of the circle with every generation of technology. And so these days, the margin has been 5 millimeters on average. But this is one of the consequences of radiation injury to the rectum. Is called radiation proctitis. And it's simply due to the close proximity of the rectum to the prostate, and because they're touching, no matter what technique you use with radiation, there's going to be some amount of rectum that will be affected by the prostate radiation. And so this is published in the New England Journal. This was an example of a 70-year-old male who got treated 10 years earlier with 64 gray, a dose that is comparatively not as high as what we use currently, but it goes to show that radiation-induced toxicities can occur many years even after the radiation. And this phenomenon has been studied for some time, and we've tried to get a better handle on what is specific to the patient that could increase their personal risk of radiation proctitis. Is there something on the radiation end in terms of how much volume of rectum got irradiated that would predict that this would happen? And so there's been a lot of research to try to prevent this from happening. There are 2 phases of radiation proctitis. There's the first phase that happens within 6 to 12 weeks after completed radiotherapy. The incidence can be up to 20%, and the side effects would be diarrhea, tenesmus, urgency, mucus discharge, or bleeding. And then once that goes away, then there's patients who will experience chronic radiation proctitis. That can occur months to years after complete radiotherapy. On average, it would occur approximately about a year after. The incidence can range from 2 to 20%. The side effects are very similar to what you see in the acute radiation proctitis, but also concludes scarring, tissue-like strictures, severe bleeding, fistula, perforation, and even bowel obstruction. So these are not very common. They're pretty rare, but we still want to do better to reduce the incidence of these terrible side effects. So what are some risk factors that predict for radiation proctitis? Dose of the radiation given to certain volumes of the rectal tissue, the percentage of the rectum that exposed to different levels of radiation, people on blood thinners, people have known active hemorrhoids, inflammatory bowel disorders, diabetes and advanced age. These have all been, through various studies, have been identified as potential risk factors for radiation proctitis. Well, how do you treat radiation proctitis? There are various things we can do, from topical enemas such as sucralfate or steroids. We can always use laser, like argon plasma coagulation. You can use chemicals like formalin, hyperbaric oxygen, and the last resort will be surgery. But even better yet, what can we do to even prevent these from happening? So with every generation machine, we're trying to get them to be more accurate and more quick to allow us to have smaller planning margins. And that circle I mentioned earlier, we're trying to make that circle as tight as possible, because the smaller your planning margin is, the less volume of rectum will be caught in your high dose area. And some of the latest radiation technologies that make the circles even smaller is having some kind of ability to assess the prostate's position during the actual radiation beam delivery. And so you have machines that can take x-rays of the pelvis during radiation and getting snapshots of those markers that are put in there and seeing if they've moved. And then there's the more advanced real-time continuous systems where you can get moment-to-moment updates of where the prostate is positioned during radiation, and that's in the form of Calypso, which is the beacons I spoke earlier, as well as a comparable technology called electric clarity, which doesn't use markers but uses a real-time ultrasound system that can take pictures during radiation delivery to tell you where the prostate is. And the other prevention strategy that will be the highlight of today's talk is injectable spacers. And so there have been several different agents that have been used from polyethylene glycol, hyaluronic acid, and collagen. The whole idea is to put that in between the prostate and the rectum so you can create create a space so the rectum won't be caught in that margin circle that I first spoke about. So back to the first strategy, to reducing margins. And so this report came out of Cedars-Sinai, where they did have a real-time tracking system with that electromagnetic beacon called Calypso. And what they were able to prove is that with a smaller margin, a smaller circle, that the decrease in quality of life on the bowels is much less compared to the old standard with larger circles. And this was exemplified here. Pre-treatment bowel scores versus post-treatment were pretty similar in this small margin group. And in the comparator studies, which use older, larger margins, you see that the bowel scores are much higher post-treatment. And so this proven principle, with a smaller margin, you can reduce bowel toxicity. This is an example of the electric clarity real-time tracking system, where during radiation you get images like this, where you can see the prostate, the bladder, and the rectum. And then during radiation, you can get a real-time image where, let me see if this works this time. So during radiation, you can see that the system is actively scanning continuously, and during radiation, you can see the prostate move right, left, up, down, side to side in real time. We can see a movement as small as 1/10 of 1 millimeter. So if the prostate moves even 1.0 millimeter, we have the ability to stop the machine, reposition you, zero these out, and then pick up where we left off. So it's really constantly monitoring during radiation if there's any shifts in the position of the prostate, so we can always be on target. So this has allowed us to have much more small planning margins instead of using the traditional, instead of using the traditional 5.0 millimeter margins. We can certainly, since we can intervene at a smaller change, like 1 or 2 millimeters, our margins are that much more tight, our circles are that much smaller to reduce the amount of rectum caught in our field. The other strategy, prevention strategy, are these injectable spacers. And so the goal of these spacers is to temporarily position the rectum away from the prostate to reduce radiation exposure. So here's a prostate rectum, and if you can place a spacer here, the rectum is that much far away from the prostate, well beyond the reach of the planning margin that you've designed, and so it won't receive the very highest doses of radiation. Throughout the years, there have been various chemicals that have been used that had already had a place in medical treatment. For example, there is a product called Duracell, and neurosurgeons use that to help seal the dura during the operation, and then after the sealant is there, it can dissolve away on its own. However, since a lot of prostate radiation treatments last for so long, the concern was that for Duracell, that the stability of the space won't last the full course of the radiation. And so the same company that was involved in Duracell started to look at how can we develop a spacing system that can endure the entire duration of the radiation course, regardless of what kind of radiation you choose. And so they reformulated to create this product called Spacer. And then it was FDA approved in April of last year, and so it's now entered the market and entered clinical use. How it works is that you have these hydrogel precursors that are injected through a needle, and then once it gets injected into that space, it turns into a solid, into like a hydrogel. And it maintains the separation for a minimum of 3 months. And over the subsequent 3 months, it starts to dissolve back to liquid again, and then you just urinate it out, and it breaks down by hydrolysis. So during the actual FDA-approved trial, this was the prostate at baseline. They put in this gel here at 3 months. You can see it still held its position. Well, again, long enough for you to complete any form of radiation you elected to have. And then the following 3 months later, they proved that the gel had dissolved. So this is another cartoon that exemplifies the benefit of the spacer with regard to prostate motion. This is not available, but the whole idea is that during radiation, this red circle exemplifies that planning margin that I spoke about, where the prostate can move anywhere in the zone of this red circle, including the rectum. But in this cartoon, you would have seen that the prostate can move anywhere in this red zone, but because the spacer is here, the rectum would be away from getting into the red zone here, so out of the very highest doses of radiation because of the spacing. So when the FDA, modern radiation, we don't, in terms of the current techniques of radiation have just gotten safer and safer over time, the question was, is something like this absolutely necessary given that through the machine technology, we've done a better job to reduce rectal toxicity. So the FDA had asked the company to do a scientific experiment to prove their point. So what the company did is they did a phase 3 trial. It was blinded, it was randomized, where throughout 20 cancer centers throughout the United States, about 222 patients participated. There was a 2-to-1 randomization. What that means is about 150 patients got the gel, and 70 patients got nothing. And they were all randomly selected. And they all got 9 weeks radiation, and 15 months later, they asked all the patients how many of them had rectal problems. So this is at the planning phase. During radiation, you can actually model how much volume of rectum is receiving the very highest dose of radiation. In blue are the folks who got the spacer, And in red are the folks who got nothing. And this 50, 60, 70, 80 represents doses of radiation. The whole idea is that the highest dose of radiation, the amount of rectal tissue is much less than for the spacer than those who got nothing. So you can see how the blue column is always less than their counterpart, red column, because of the spacing. But when they ask patients clinically, like how many folks have rectal problems, they found that in the control group, only 1 out of 14.2 patients had some kind of rectal problem, and that's kind of respectable for current modern radiation, 1 out of 14. They were able to take that small number of complications and made it even less frequent, where people in the spacer group, 1 out of 49.3 patients had a rectal problem. So the whole idea was taking something that has a low complication rate even lower with the spacer. So the other thing that they looked at is how safe it was to put it in, because if there are a lot of complications with it, you know, is it worth going from this to this? And the answer was about 10% of patients had some kind of temporary rectal discomfort because of the placement of the gel. And in my clinical experience, that's a very fair observation, and the fact that you've never had anything in this part of your body before other than a piece of stool, so it's going to feel like a piece of stool for a couple of days to a couple of weeks, but eventually I find that patients their rectum will kind of adjust a new position, and it becomes something that's no longer bothersome, unless they really focus on it and try to sit a funny way to really try to bring it out. But most people find that their body adjusts pretty well to it. So the effort it takes to put it in wasn't, and the side effects of putting it in wasn't too complicated, and the morbidity or side effects of putting in, when you weigh against the benefit of the spacer, now you have a compelling product that can help improve patient safety. So how do we put it in? So in our clinic, we do it as an outpatient basis. Pre-procedure, just like the prostate biopsy, we ask you to take some antibiotics. About an hour before the procedure, we have you take some Valium. And then we numb up the perineum with local lidocaine. And once things are all numbed up, then we go ahead and place the spacer. And post-procedure, we ask you to complete the antibiotics. So this is illustration of what we do. To see everything inside, you need a transrectal ultrasound, because the sensors here is able to visualize this really small space where we would like the needle placed. So you can see how we place the needle very carefully in this small space, guided by the images we're seeing on the real-time ultrasound. And then we put in a tester, we put in water, because we want to verify that there is actually a space in which the spacer gel can get into, because it's very rare, but sometimes patients had prior surgeries here, or some kind of scar tissue that just doesn't open up. It's exceedingly rare, but we always want to verify and be safe with this procedure, so we put in a tester just to make sure that there is a viable space to put in the spacer. And then once we do that, we leave the needle in, we switch out the syringe, and we attach the spacer material, and then we just inject it through. And it's kind of like an epoxy setup, where the moment it gets, you don't see the needle here, but so that it looks like an epoxy setup, but in the needle, the two syringes mix together, and then when they get in here, it instantly turns into a gel. So this is an example of a case from our clinic. This is pre-gel injection, and then post-gel you can see the separation from the gel. This magenta is that small planning margin we use in our clinic with the real-time tracking. You can see how the rectum is really separated nicely from the very high dose area in this magenta. Another way to look at it is from the side view here. So there's a prostate, here's a rectum. You see now the gel's right here, and how in that magenta planning structure is really separated nicely from the rectum due to this gel. So I found ever since, it got FDA approved in April, we brought it into our clinic as fast as we could because we thought, this is a great product, and we started in May. And so we were the first ones in the country to use it for SBRT, and also ever since then we've just been doing it. We're the first to be certified to do it, and we have the highest volume and the most experience. So it's really served our patients well. We find that there is a reduction in the volume and percentage of rectum receiving very high dose of radiation. And when appropriate, because of the extra spacing, I can now increase the dose to parts of the gland that has the highest tumor burden to allow for dose escalation when appropriate. So I can increase the dose that much more safely because of that extra space. I found that there was no complications of infection or rectal injury related to the actual placement of the gel. And importantly, the spacer is really versatile because it allows us to use, because it can be used with various forms of radiation. So I've had patients that wanted dose escalated MRT, so we can use it for that. I've had patients who wanted HDR monotherapy, so we use it in combination with that. For example, we share patients with UCLA for their brachytherapy, and some people want this in preparation for the combo therapy, so we've been happy to do it for that. And proton therapy, for example, we have patients from Scripps who's asked us to put it in before the proton therapy, and we use it before SBRT as well. So it's really versatile, and regardless of the type of radiation used, we find that there is going to be a meaningful benefit, certainly in the planning phase. What remains to be seen, the FDA trial only tested a 9-week radiation, so we'll need more clinical data to see whether we see comparable clinical benefits with the other forms of radiation, but theoretically it should pan out to be very similar. You can always go to the Spacer website to find the closest certified center. And in conclusion, radiation proctitis, it's a potential complication of radiation. And as the machines have gotten more and more advanced, we found that the rectal toxicity has gone down, but still there is some of it going on, but whatever low rate of complication that we have now can be further reduced with a hydrogel spacer such as Spacer. Thank you for your attention.
Very good.
Thank you, Doctor. Now, if anybody has any questions, please raise your hands, because I'll give you a mic so everybody can hear.
The slide before the risk factors, you had the possible side effects. I didn't know what the second side effect was after diarrhea.
Tenesmus?
What is that?
Tenesmus is when you have a lot of urgency of bowel movements, and this is a very, very unpleasant sensation where you really can't control your holding in your bowel because it's just very spastic and a lot of urgency. So it has to do with the irritation of the sphincter.
Any other questions right here? Yes, sir.
I noticed in your bio that you were trained in proton therapy. Do you find that to be more accurate regarding the side effects that you were talking about versus the regular external beam radiation?
So I think right now they're really trying to study that. There's a phase 3 trial comparing proton radiotherapy and IMRT. Mass General is part of that, as well as University of Pennsylvania, to really try to answer that question. Because if you look at different papers throughout time, you'll find a lot of papers saying one way and other papers saying the other way. And a lot of it is hard to interpret because they're all based on retrospective data or comparing treatments done from different eras, different techniques. And so we find the best way to try to settle that question is to do a formal phase 3 trial. So that is certainly undergoing right now, and something that all radiation oncologists are looking forward to, because we get asked that question all the time. And unfortunately, we can't give you a pure answer without giving you the results of a pure experiment. And so, and that's what we're all looking forward to. But when you look at retrospective or even prospective data from either IMRT, you look at Sloan Kettering, they've done 9-week radiation pretty much longer than anywhere else, and they've published 10-year success rates and complication rates with their very aggressive IMRT regimen. And you look at some of the, not just the older proton therapy experience from like the Mass General Boost trials and the more contemporary like University of Florida proton trials, you'll find that the rectal toxicity rates are getting lower and lower regardless of the technique you use. I think proton therapy, their main issues have been the use of a rectal balloon for stabilization. And when you put a rectal balloon for stabilization, you actually start pushing the rectum directly into the prostate. And so that small segment of rectum is caught in the very highest doses of the radiation field. So now you start seeing some more proton therapy centers like the one in Knoxville and Scripps, and eventually they're adopting more and more things like the spacer to do the opposite, to try to not push the rectum directly into the field, but to create that space. They have to research further whether that amount of rectal spacer is enough to settle this issue about prostate motion management. And so because the balloon is a much more larger entity that can accomplish that stabilization, but the spacer gel is nowhere near the size of a balloon. And so to think that it can provide the same amount of stability is not certain. But in the end, I think you can do a lot of research studies about prostate motion with either technique, but also what's equally important is to look at the clinical outcomes, and that's something that I'm sure that Scripps is looking into.
Well, the question that just occurred to me when you mentioned that, they thought about the rectal balloon, as you said, with the spacer installed in it, would let you put a stabilization on the rectum position and separate it.
I think that they're still working out the best combination to use. From different presentations I've seen, for example, the Knoxville Proton Group, my understanding is they just use the spacer alone without the rectal balloon. But I think them and other proton centers will have to kind of work through, their experience of is it better to have both in, or can they get away with just the spacer alone? And that's the kind of research they need to do.
But they're looking at that obviously.
Yeah, they would have to, because the prostate, proton's a very precise treatment, and so if there's some motion that's not accounted for, then concern is that they might not be hitting the target or not know where the target is at all times. But these are very well-respected centers, so that I'm sure they're doing the appropriate research.
Well, I have one other question, and that is, of course, what kind of cost is involved in this, adding the Space-Oar installation onto the...
Right. It's a very new product, and so I find that the insurance coverage is really highly variable on what part of the country you're in, what kind of setting it's being done in, what insurance you have, and so that's why we have to look at every single individual case. But so eventually, it should get, the phase 3 trial is a very robust trial, robust data, so eventually I'm hopeful that coverage will become nearly universal. I think it's one of those things, how a bill becomes a law. It takes a long time to get a code and get that percolated through all the insurance companies so that can be identified, quantified, and reimbursed. That's the exact process the company is doing right now through all the different insurance companies.
So but you don't have a rough estimate of what the cost is if there is no coverage?
Yeah, no, it's a rough estimate of, I would say, is a couple thousand, several $1,000s.
Thank you.
I'm sitting here wondering how wonderful it would be if you could completely encapsulate the whole prostate so that you'd have freedom in all directions.
Yeah, that would be nice. And so,
Even if it took an operation to do that, it might be worthwhile.
right, yeah, we'll cross our fingers until that day.
Ron is one of our board of directors, and he will make statements, not necessarily a question, but it brings things to mind. Anybody else have any questions? Oh yeah, right here, sorry. We got to hear from the significant other's point of view.
Hello, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
At the beginning of your talk, you mentioned a GPS type thing,
Right.
and, excuse me, I wrote down everything. Would the Calypso and the Electroclarity be that?
Yeah, they're two different products.
Okay,
They both,
that's the GPS thing you were
So,
mentioning?
Calypso is often branded as like a GPS system because you actually put in beacons inside. Clarity is different. It doesn't track actual beacons. It takes continuous images of the prostate. So, two different real-time tracking technologies.
Great, thank you.
Anybody else? Well, thank you very much for a very, very good clarification of the Space-Oar, Doctor. It's reasonably new. I think, as you said, it was FDA approved in April.
That's last year.
April of 2015,
2014.
2014. Oh,
It's
it's not-
2016 already.
That's what I was going to say. I thought 2016. It was just approved. And Dr. Kim is obviously on the cutting technology of cutting edge here. So, if it's just April and he's already performing and doing it, and with the background that he's had and all the higher educational facilities that he's been to, wow. Go see him to see Space-Oar, and that's enough for the commercial. But anyway, we can't afford to pay him here, but what we will do is, doctor's time is money, and we'll save him time by giving him this coffee cup so he can drink his coffee on the way to work and not have to sit home for breakfast and drink it. Now, this is your second one. Do you still have the first one I gave you?
Is that home?
Do you use it?
It's sometimes.
Sometimes.
It's in the rotation.
That's kind of a hesitancy. Okay, thank you very much. Now, thank you, Dr. Kim. And before I wrap this up, I would like to say one thing. We will probably see more of the Space-Oar at the PCRI conference in the Marriott Hotel in September. I don't remember the exact date. Does anybody have that magazine I gave you that showed you the exact date it is? Dr. Kim, will you be there?
I'm not sure yet, but at the last one I did present about the Space-Oar at the mid-year meeting.
Yeah. This is the convention or seminars of all seminars for prostate cancer. They do it once a year. What's the date there, sir?
September 9th to 11th.
September, I believe, right?
September 9th.
Yeah, September 9th to the 11th. If you make your reservations before the end of June, I believe it is, or June 15th, you get in for $60 per person. If you wait after that, it's $120 per person. If you want to go there and spend half a day sitting at the prostate forum booth, I'll get you in for free. So, free is good, right? So, but by all means, please try and make it to the PCRI convention on Friday, Saturday, and Sunday, 9th, 10th, and 11th of September. There's more prostate cancer information than you can digest in a lifetime there given in those 3 days. Dr. Kim, I believe, was there last year, weren't you? And the best of the best are there. So I'm done with my commercial now on that. Thank you very much, Dr. Kim.